You clicked on this video, that means you have the same questions I had when I decided to go with a distribution plate. I'm used to using these. Maybe you're used to using these. Maybe you've never water cooled before and you're deciding, should I go with a round reservoir or should I go with one of those really pretty distribution plates? Well, definitely don't miss this video because I'm going to explain the differences between the two because there are differences. They're different, but same. So while the theme is playing, hit that subscribe button, and when we come back, we're going to find out which one is right for you. Welcome to 2020 Tech for You. If you're new here, I really hope we gain a new subscriber. If you're a returning viewer, well, thank you for coming back. And don't forget, guys, down below in the description, as always, there's links for everything you see in this video and a couple other links down below. So if you want to help the channel to grow, please check those things out down below. All right, enough of that. As I said in the intro, we're going to talk about the regular round reservoir pump combos. We're going to talk about the distribution plates that also come with pumps too. So let's start with the old school. Let's start with the original. Kind of the original. Back in the day, we used things for like fish tanks, so the pumps, the fully submersibles. But these are what made it more accessible to people who just wanted to water cool and didn't want to have to go through all the extra modifications that it took to go water cooling back in the day. And Corsair, especially with the Hydro X lineup, it's not an ad, I promise you, I only have a few hundred subscribers, makes it super simple to put a loop together. Especially if you're gonna go soft tubing, it's just a matter of bolting this in, plugging it, and turning it on. Pretty much, you know, it's not really that hard. Neither is hardline tubing nowadays. It's actually pretty simple. I have videos on that, and I'll link one here. But with these reservoir pump combos, it's always gonna be the same thing. You're gonna have an inlet, an outlet, and then you're gonna have a couple more other areas that are open that you can add a drain valve, you can add a temp sensor, and then at the top you're gonna have a fill port, a return. It's pretty much always gonna be that way. Now with a distribution block or a distribution plate, DistroPlate, that changes. It changes a lot. You have lots of different inlets and outlets. Now, if you bought a EK version of these blocks, a lot of them are going to come with instructions telling you the inlets and the outlets. But some other brands will say it doesn't come with instructions because you may put it in a different case and hook it up with a different motherboard. Did you catch that? A different motherboard. So a lot of you by now, if you've done a little bit of research, you know that majority of distribution blocks or plates, they are case specific. So let me tell you guys a quick story on why I'm even making this video. This is the first distro plate I've ever bought. I've never worked with one before. And I went in assuming, I know that was stupid, that it shouldn't be any different than, you know, the reservoir pump, the cylindrical version setup. It should all be inlet, outlet, hook it up, move on in life. Well, it's not. And I looked up different videos, diagrams, anything to help me better understand how does this work. When you're looking for these, you definitely want to make sure it's for your case. Do whatever extra research you can. Now, you can make other ones fit. Now, if this one is not for this case, which is still confusing to me, well, I still got it in. It's still not going to be a problem to hook it up. And believe it or not, it still lines up with the CPU, which is another thing we got to talk about. So, this is the inside of my PC, obviously. Now, here's the inlet, outlet for GPU, inlet, outlet for CPU behind that. And this would be your CPU's inlet and outlet also. So, this is the inlet outlet into the distribution plate. Now this piece, as you notice, is taller than the rest. That's because this piece is made to move up and down. If I loosen these 4 screws that go around here, I can adjust this, I believe, 5 millimeters up, 5 millimeters down. That's so I could better line up my tubing with this right here, my CPU's inlet. Reason being is distribution plates are made to give you a clean, straight connection. I'll put a picture right here, how it's usually supposed to look. So you want to make sure that this is lined up with your CPU block. So it gives you like a 5 millimeter adjustment for different motherboards. And that's kind of what I'm getting at next. So the more research I did, I ended up finally finding that it is case specific and even motherboard specific in a lot of cases. and it'll tell you the different motherboards that it's been fitted for, I guess would be the word, to make sure you keep nice clean running lines. Also, if you notice, my GPU is in the vertical position, really blocking the heck out of my CPU block. So that's going to make an extra problem for me when I actually go to install the tubing. But I think I got the routing figured out. It's not going to be, perfect like that picture, like this picture here, but it's still going to look, pretty nice and straight. Otherwise, I'll just have to use a little, illusion work, but I'll figure that out. The main takeaway is make sure when you're looking for a distribution plate that it fits your case and you buying a motherboard or own a motherboard that it's been fitted with already in that case for the distribution block. If you want to make sure 110% your runs will be perfectly straight. But again, some of them have this piece that can move up to 5 millimeters to make sure you can add height to it, bring it down so you can line it up with a majority good amount of motherboards. Now, one thing I have noticed with motherboards is the CPU socket usually doesn't tend to really bounce that much around the board, unless we're talking like overclocking boards where the CPU sockets flip so the two DIMM slots will be above it so it's closer to the CPU socket. Those are special overclocking boards like this one from EVGA, the FTW series, which is an overclocking board. But you're not going to be doing all this with an overclocking board. A board like that, you might be using LN2 in a totally different world at that point. Otherwise, you really shouldn't be too worried about it, because again, I never really seen sockets to do a big major jump. Maybe a few millimeters, different in height and left and right. But again, if not, you can always buy adapters. These like 90s and T fittings and 45-degree angles, and then there's always bending your tubes if you're going hardline tube. If you're going soft tube, then really and truly none of this matters if you're going soft tubing, by the way. You're going hard tubing, you're gonna bend most of that. If not, you would just get the full 90-degree fitting and be done with it. This is an extension 90, so it's made for like plugging straight into the distribution block, CPU block, GPU block, like this one right here. There's another one that's a 90-degree angle turn, and that's it. Now we're going to talk about the inlets and the outlets on the distribution plate. When you're putting a loop together, you're going to use common sense that for every component that's getting water cooled, you need two fittings. So basically these right here. So your tubing could go in and lock in, and you don't have to worry about your tubing flippy floppy. Even if you're using these 90 angle extenders, you still need one of these to plug the tubing into these, just like so. So rule of thumb, 2 fittings per component that's getting water cooled. That also goes for radiators and your reservoir pump combo. So I'm going to use for an example a single component cooling PC. So just a CPU, only the CPU, no GPU cooling, nothing else. One CPU, one radiator. You would need 2 fittings for the CPU, 2 fittings for the radiator, 2 fittings for your reservoir pump combo. That comes out to 6 fittings. Your radiator is going to need 2 fittings. Your reservoir pump is going to need 2 fittings, so the hoses could go through here. And then your CPU is going to need 2 fittings. If you add a GPU, 2 more fittings. But again, let's just go back to CPU. 6 fittings. 2 for our CPU to recap, 2 for our radiator, and 2 for our reservoir pump combo. That's it, 6. Now, let's talk about the distribution plate and how it works. So real quick, this distribution plate, it doesn't replace my front glass, it just goes behind it. So my pump and my fittings and my holes and all that are on the same side. Whereas with one that would go here, your fittings would go on one side and your pump would be on the opposite side with an additional hole so you can add a drain. And I think even the refill port on the top would be on this side. I'm not too sure, it may be, I don't know. The first thing you're going to notice on my distribution plate is all this tape with letters on it. So once I started to get a handle on understanding how this works, I started putting tape and adding like GPU in, GPU out, RAD in, RAD out, CPU in, CPU out. That way, as I'm doing my mock-up, I could see where they go, and also maybe a little bit easier for you guys to follow along. So let's get the obvious stuff out of the way. This is our pump right here. This big chamber is our reservoir. You see this big nice chamber right here? You see the black going around? That's a gasket. So basically liquid's only gonna be in here, in here, in here, and down here. Wherever you see the black gasket, that's where it's gonna make sure water doesn't spill over inside of the distro plate. So this will just have liquid and these and these and so on and so on. Our pump is down here. So the pump is going to be pulling water from the reservoir here and then putting it out through here. I'm gonna get a little bit more through that in a minute. But again, this is the main reservoir, the big piece that has the Lee & Lee logo in it. It's always the bigger one that's the main reservoir where the pump's going to be pulling liquid. Here's our main reservoir, which feeds this area down here where our pump is. So if you notice those two holes, you'll notice those two chambers. First one, that big one, is the reservoir, and the one on the bottom of the reservoir. Now the pump, which is on the inside, is connected to both of those. The big one on the top, our reservoir, and that little one. The pump actually has two holes in it, so it could pull water from the reservoir and put it into that other spot right there. So right here's our pump, reservoir, and the second chamber down here. Our pump is actually connecting both of these together. Up to your top left or top right, the highest point is always going to be your fill port. That's where you're going to add the liquid in. Make sure you have a bottle with the hose. You can order those off of EK, Amazon, $5, $12, whatever. Make sure you have one of those. And then you're going to see holes now everywhere else. And then down at the far bottom right, this one's supposed to be your drain. So inlet at the farthest top left and our drain at the farthest bottom right. All these other holes that are underneath all this tape, if you notice, there's a lot of holes. So you're thinking right now to yourself, well, after I connect my GPU, my CPU, my RAD, and I put my loop together, I'm gonna need a lot of plugs to fill in the holes I'm not gonna be using, right? Yeah, no. You're actually intended to use every hole on here except for the fill port and the drain port. Those are always gonna be used for filling and draining. But the rest of these ports are made to be utilized. RAD in, RAD out. CPU out, CPU in. GPU out, GPU in. RAD in, RAD out. Well, Joe, what if I'm not hooking up a GPU to my loop? What about these two? I just plug those off then. No, again, all these need to be connected even if you're not planning to have a GPU in your loop or a second radiator. We're gonna go with the one CPU, one radiator setup again. So CPU, radiator. We're gonna pretend our radiator is at the top of our loop. So you would connect the radiator and your CPU in your loop. But the rest of these cannot be plugged off. You still need to move the fluid chamber to chamber. Because if not, how's it gonna get there? Because remember, it's only gonna have liquid where you see the black rubber on the inside. That's the gasket that stops the liquid from spilling over. Really hope you guys are understanding me. I promise you it's going to get simple in a second. Say all your connections are at the top. Your CPU is going to go here. Your radiator is going to go here. Remember, your reservoir is over here. Now, this doesn't matter if your CPU is down here and your radiator is over here. That doesn't matter here, but we're just going to say CPU, radiator. So your radiator fluid gets nice and cool, comes back into the reservoir, comes down to the pump. The pump then is going to feed this chamber. This chamber then has to connect to this chamber. This chamber then has to connect to this chamber. You're starting to catch on. Connect to this chamber and then back. So if you only have a CPU radiator, what you need to do then is take some tubing and connect them. You got to complete the flow. You have to make sure these are all connected, moving one to each other. Because if you're not, then the water's not going to be able to get there. So again, radiator, CPU. We'd still have to connect this one to this one. Then we'd have to connect this one to this one. We connected our radiator here. We connected our CPU here. But we still need to move from here to here, here to here. We have to keep the liquid flowing. So you do not plug these off. They need to be connected one way or another. Either through a component that's going to be cooled or just a tube going like this. You get it? So how our flow order would look like with just a CPU and a radiator in our loop. Again, all these would have to be connected. You can't plug none of them. It would go from the reservoir to this tank, from this tank to this tank, then to this tank, which then would go to your CPU. then come back from your CPU here, and then this would go to your rad, then from your rad back here, refilling your reservoir. Remember earlier where I said 2 fittings per component that's going to be water cooled? 2 for the CPU, 2 for the radiator, 2 for the cylindrical pump res combo. Not with this one. Because you have to connect every one of these, you're gonna have to get a compression or barbed fitting for every connection here, for every hole here. That's even if you're not going to be using all of the ports. You still, remember, have to connect the ports together with a tube, a hose, however style you're going, hardline, soft tubing, it doesn't matter. Now what it's going to be is if you're going to be using every port on here except for the fill port and the drain port, is 4 per component. 4 for your CPU, 2 that go in your CPU block, 2 that go in here, 2 in your radiator, 2 that go in here, 2 for the other radiator, 2, and so on and so on. Even if you're not connecting all of these to some component in your PC, you're still gonna need a fitting to connect the chambers together. And because this one is an 8-port DistroPlate, that's 8 fittings, period. And then 2 per component that's getting water cooled. So if you're going to be water cooling GPU, CPU, 2 radiators, then guess what? That's going to be 16 fittings. So 4 for the CPU, 4 for GPU, 4 for the radiator, 4 for the other radiator, and then cap, unless you're going to go drain port. So I'm going to recap everything we talked about in this video real quick. So first off, if you're going to get a case specific distribution plate, make sure that it fits your case. Triple, quadruple check. If you want to make sure that all the fittings and all the tubing runs perfect, like straight lines, then you may want to look into a motherboard that they've already tested with it, or find a video where someone used that DistroPlate in the same case you're using with the motherboard that you may have. If your DistroPlate has this block that moves up and down, because at least then you know you have a better chance of lining it up where your CPU socket's at. But again, a lot of these are case and motherboard specific, but that's only to run straight lines. But again, you can put a DistroPlate in pretty much any case. Just make sure the height is not a problem, you know what I mean, and the width. Otherwise, you should be fine. And then your fittings. You're gonna need a fitting for every port in your DistroPlate, whether you're gonna use every port or not. Because remember, you still need to connect all these chambers together one way or another. Either it's going to a component that's gonna get water cooled, or it's just gonna connect itself to the next reservoir in the distro block. And that's pretty much it. These were things I tried to find on the internet and I couldn't find. I looked up this information and there was nothing there. So if you're asking the same questions, I really hope this video helped you to understand. So I'd like to thank everybody who joined me today in this video. I really hope we gained a new subscriber, guys. If you want to help the channel, there are ways down below. You could contact me directly to help the channel. There is something you could do that won't cost $1, not a dime. You could subscribe, like, comment, share these videos with your friends. Those things, they don't cost anything. They're free to do. And again, down below in the description, you'll find links to our Amazon affiliate to all the components here. Well, kind of. You can't find blocks for certain GPUs on Amazon. So I'll have another link down below for formulamod.com. But besides that, well, that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know if you enjoyed it down in the comments. Tell me down below if there's something that you didn't understand. Maybe I could tell you in a different way. Maybe I could figure a better way of explaining it to you. And that's it. And I hope to see you guys on the next one. Late.